Everyone, welcome to Chapter 8, discussion on location. Specifically, we're going to consider 7 major factors that affect location decisions, and we'll also apply the factor rating method. Before we get into the 7 major factors, we'll discuss some considerations, and we'll group them in scope of locations. We'll start with the country itself, so maybe we're considering Canada, and the region, maybe perhaps British Columbia, and of course a site. An example could be perhaps Robson Street. So why is the country important? Well, countries can be ranked. This is an example here of a country being ranked on sort of 12 different factors. So it might be based off of how many institutions, infrastructure, labor market, market size, and things of that nature. When it comes to the economy specifically, for instance, here we see an example where Switzerland is highly ranked in terms of their economic potential. So countries are important to consider. We can then bring it down into the actual region. So here in Canada, we might be considering opening up a business in British Columbia. Why do we have to consider specific provinces? Well, again, depending on the industry that we have, we need to think about whether or not we'll have enough of labor availability. Maybe we have to consider different types of regulations or maybe taxes as well. All those costs that are kind of associated with that. So we talked about taxes. This is an example here where, by region, we might have to pay different types of provincial taxes. So we have to consider that as a regional consideration. And then finally, we have our site consideration. So if we think about maybe we want to open our business on Robson Street. Why would we want to do such a thing? Might have a great idea in regards to foot traffic or market size, but perhaps we have to think about the costs associated with it because maybe you might have noticed this, but on Robson Street we have a lot of stores closing, and probably the reason for that is because they have the second highest cost in Canada in terms of their rent. Okay, so things we need to think about, but also even just whether we're on the corner or whether we're next to good parking or zoning, different types of zoning issues. That's all important to consider when we're looking specifically on the site. So those are our location considerations. Let's try and group them a little bit more specifically when we look at the major factors. So the first factor is this idea of labor productivity. Okay, so you've probably all heard of this concept of companies going out and hiring foreign workers or cheaper labor outside of their country. Okay, but we need to think about the productivity as a whole, not just having cheap labor. We want to understand that are we actually getting efficiency out of our labor? So in order to do that, we would calculate our cost per unit. Okay, so it's not just the labor cost that we need to consider, but we need to think about how productive is our labor. In other words, how many products can that labor produce? Okay, so a good example in your textbook is we have a company that's I believe it's a telecom company, and they're based in the U.S. So if they decided to go ahead and operate within the U.S. and hire their local labor, you're looking at about $70 cost per day. Okay, and that labor would produce about 60 units. So our overall cost per unit is a 1.17. Now, if we decided, let's say this company decides to go out maybe to Mexico or somewhere outside of the U.S., URAS or so forth. Now, yes, the cost is cheaper, so they can hire cheaper workers. But one thing to note is that the productivity greatly reduces. So they're 3 times less as efficient. So even though the cost is cheaper, the productivity is not quite the same. They're actually cost them more, 1.25 per unit. So just remember, cheap labor doesn't always produce a cheaper productivity. Okay, something to consider. So that is our number one factor, is the productivity of your labor. That's really important to decide where you'll actually locate your business. Another important aspect, and this has been particularly important when we're discussing the invasion of Ukraine from Russia, is there's some political risks, exchange rates and currency risks that might occur. Okay, so if this is happening, in a location, then this is something you definitely want to keep an eye on. So just an example here, we're talking about the Russian invasion, which happened on February 24th, 2022. So just about here. So if you look before the Russian invasion, you could see that the ruble, which is the Russians' currency, compare that to the US dollar, was at least stable, not a lot of fluctuations. But as soon as we had that war, you can see the instability, you can see the fluctuation. So there's a lot of risk associated when it comes to currency rate. So it's really important, ideally, sometimes you can't predict these things, but it's important to at least consider that currency rates is really an important aspect of where you want to locate your business. Another important consideration or factor is just overall the idea of costs. Okay, so when we look at costs, we can determine costs as either tangible or intangible. Tangible, what we mean, again, we've sort of discussed some of these, but overall, just the cost of, whether it's your labor or your taxes and materials and things of that nature. But more importantly, the intangible costs, things that are almost challenging to, quantify, and that's what we mean by intangible. So, if we expect a huge labor market, maybe we want to relocate a business, is there enough education, public transport, community, quality of life, all these factors that, the people who are going to be supporting this business, they need to make sure that their families can be happy and prosperous, that we don't have a lot of turnover. So we need to think about that as well. Now, when it comes to costs, specifically, we talked a little bit about taxes before, but there's been some interesting collaborations or interesting acquisitions, should I say, in order to remove some of these costs. So for instance, Burger King, what they've done is when they took over, they acquired Tim Hortons, they moved their head office to Canada. And the reason why a lot of people suggest that this was a strategy was so that they could evade taxes in the US. Okay, so this happens a lot where companies might try and move their head office. Okay, again, going back to this idea of location, move their locations to countries that have that pay cheaper corporate taxes. So again, something to consider is just the overall implications of costs, whether they're tangible or intangible. Moving on to number 4. So we have political risk, values, and culture. Okay. So, we've talked about Russia already in terms of the currency risk, but there's also another very predominant action that's been happening, that did happen, was this idea that, a lot of companies kind of, remove their businesses from Russia. And that's basically because of this idea that it didn't really align with the culture of their businesses, right? So obviously there was a lot of protests as well, and people were promoting it. So, whether it's political risk or just values and culture in general, it's this idea that a lot of companies recognize that they needed to remove themselves from Russia because they weren't aligned with their values as well. Okay. Another example is with culture, particularly a very interesting article about how Walmart had some challenges when they went to Germany, trying to open up their stores there. They had a lot of cultural differences, and that makes a lot of challenges when they were there as well. So we'll do a little bit more reading on that later on, but definitely important to understand whether or not the company that the business, the organization is aligned with the type of culture and where it's located. Okay. And finally, we kind of group these together. Okay. So 5, 6, and 7 is really all about just being within a certain proximity. Now, it could be the market, suppliers, or even your competitors. Okay. And this is what we mean by just proximity. And depending on the type of industry, it's really important. We'll see some examples throughout, but here's just some examples here in terms of being in the right proximity of the suppliers, particularly when it comes to winemaking. Okay, so there's a reason why certain areas grow a lot of wine, and that's usually because they're within proximity of the resources that they need, or the suppliers, which is the climate, the type of land they need. If you think about it, the terroir of a wine is really important. It's part of how the wine is grown, and it's really important to be in a certain region. Now, of course, you also see competitors near there as well. Okay, so there's a lot of proximity when it comes to wine growing. But also, if you look at fast food chains, there's this concept of clustering. Okay, this is very common. And of course, I'm sure as a consumer, you see this a lot. You'll see a lot of the same type of offerings in a certain specific area, right? So, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk more about that as well. But for now, we just understand that is obviously another location decision, is that you want to be, typically it's actually, believe it or not, an advantage to be within a very close proximity of your competitors. Okay, so this idea of keeping your enemies close can be very effective when it comes to location decisions. But more on that when we get into the class. So those are the 7 major factors. Okay, we had grouped some of them at the end there. Let's talk a little bit about the factor rating method. So this is another way just to help you make a decision. In a sense, you're trying to quantify the factors, and you're basically weighting or prioritizing some of the factors, which ones are most important, and ultimately you're trying to rank or score, making a decision on where you might want to locate your business. So here is an example where we have a theme park, and they're deciding on whether or not they should locate their theme park in France or Denmark. Okay, so they're applying the factor rated method, and basically what you do is you have a list of sort of factors that are important. Then you're going to give them a weight, assign a weight, and then you're going to score each country. So in this case, we're scoring France, and then we score Denmark. And basically just do a little bit of math, and you're going to finally get a score for each of the countries. In this case, looks like France won using the factor rated method. But again, we'll spend a little bit more time on that. Okay, I just wanted to show you that. You're welcome to pause the video and try and do your own calculations. But this is what we mean with a factor rated method. Helps us make decisions based off of the most important factors in the location considerations. So that's our 7 major factors that affect local location decisions. And then finally, we've applied the factor rating method to that theme park example. Thanks for watching, and we will see you shortly.